should get us started now. Thank you all for coming for another session of our fall seminar series. And today our speaker is Dr. Meagan Schipanski. Dr. Schipanski is an associate professor in the Department of Soil and Crop Sciences at Colorado State University. Her research group applies system-based approaches to improving the sustainability of cropping system, including topics of crop diversity, soil health, nutrient and water management, while the core of her work focuses on carbon and nitrogen cycling at the field scale. Her work spans from rhizosphere scale studies in the greenhouse to land scale modeling studies. Current projects in Dr. Schipanski's lab include evaluating diversification strategies within dryland cropping system, integrated approaches to groundwater management with a focus on Ogallala Aquifer, and analysis of food systems that benefit both rural communities and urban consumers. Dr. Schipanski has worked, lived, and farmed in varied climate regions across northern half of the United States. Originally from Kansas, Dr. Schipanski received her BA degree in biology from Oberlin College in Ohio, a PhD degree from Cornell University, and conducted postdoctoral research at McGill University in Montreal and Penn State University. So please help me welcome Dr. Meagan Schipanski.
Wonderful. Thanks very much. Wave your hand in the back if you have a hard time hearing me. Speak up more. Okay. Let's see. Does it help if I move the microphone up? Maybe. Is that any better? Or is that worse? That's worse.
It didn't really change.
Okay. Try that. Is that any better? All right. I'll just speak up. I'll pretend I'm teaching. How about that? Okay. So thanks very much for inviting me to be here. I've really enjoyed the conversations already today. We got a late start, so I'm going to get rolling on some of this. So the context that we're working in right now is that we've actually been really successful in producing crop in the last few years. The trajectories that were put forward about a decade ago by Dave Tellman that we'd need to double food protection by 2050, we've actually been meeting or exceeding those goals with our grain yields, especially over the last few years. That image from National Geographic over there is actually an image I've seen at grain elevators near us in eastern Colorado or western Kansas, where the elevators are filled to capacity and grain, often the sorghum, the lower value grain, is piled on the ground outside those elevators. So we're doing pretty good at producing food. But at the same time, especially with market prices today, farmers are getting squeezed. And so that image on the right is a recent analysis by the Economic Research Service showing that median farm income, the income from the farm for household farms, is actually negative. And most of their income is coming from off the farm. And so we're seeing this again and again in our region where in our dryland systems, farmers are operating on pretty narrow margins. And so the low wheat prices really are squeezing people in real ways. And so it kind of comes to this question of, we also have concerns of changing climate and limited resources. So I'm going to come back and touch later on the Ogallala Aquifer, where we've been doing quite a bit of work. It's a groundwater aquifer that spans under parts of 8 states, all the way from the southern tip of South Dakota down to Texas. And those groundwater levels on average, but not homogeneously, have been declining since we started using that resource about 50 or 60 years ago. So we're working with less resources. We're producing a lot of crop. Climates are changing. And so this kind of brings to the question of this concept of resilience. And so I'm going to introduce 2 different ways we can define that in our growing systems. And first, I'm going to take sort of an ecological approach to this. And there was this nice paper by Anna Peterson out of Emily Gaudin's lab at UC Davis, where they outlined the different ways we can maintain resilience in agricultural systems. There's external factors that, like our inputs, that help maintain production in a certain trough, right? And we're trying to stay within that trough and not get our systems shifted into potentially a less sustainable or less productive trough. But we can also use policies, crop insurance, and markets, which can be stabilizing and destabilizing forces to maintain those systems in their current state. There are also a lot of internal regulating factors, and this is what I'm going to focus more on today, is how do we build resilience so that we deepen that trough and maintain the ability of that system persist, even though there's stress is put upon it, by enhancing things like nitrogen, carbon, water cycling, pest regulation within the system. So internal regulatory capacity. So, if you guys can see that, maybe. So here's what I'm going to try to do in the short time we have, and I hope to leave enough time for discussion, is I'm going to talk about two examples in that first realm of how do we enhance sort of the internal cycling capacity of these systems for resilience, talking about nitrogen regulation, because I work now in a very semi-arid region. It was nice. I spent 10 years working in more humid regions, so it's nice to come back and talk to people who care a lot about nitrate leaching. We just care about managing water. Part two, cropping diversification in our water-limited systems. So again, changing climates and looking at how we might be working for different functions in those different climate contexts. And then I'm going to expand out a bit near the end and talk about different ways we might want to think about resilience when we actually think about the fact that agriculture exists within a human system, and thinking about shared governance of groundwater resources and how we can leverage urban consumer interest in food to support rural communities by taking a bigger, broader perspective. So, the required nitrogen cycle diagram right here for you. I tried to make this talk without it, but I couldn't, so I brought it back in. So, nitrogen we largely manage through synthetic nitrogen additions. This is a very susceptible pool to leaching and loss, our nitrate and ammonia pools through fertilizer. And despite decades of research, nitrogen use efficiency in our grain cropping systems, the recent global estimate hasn't changed much from earlier estimates at about 50%. It's not great, right? We spent a lot of time, a lot of energy focusing on managing timing, placement, things of fertilizer, and we're still losing a lot of nitrogen from our systems. So one area that I have done quite a bit of work, and I'll talk about a little bit briefly, but then try to move on from there, is the potential to use cover crops as a sink for that nitrogen. So we can manage that nitrogen in time while the crop is growing, but there's a lot of reasons why we might want to look at the temporal dynamics and try to manage it at other times of the year. So this was an older study where we looked at actually a simulation model, collaborating with Armin and Kamanyan at Penn State, where we looked at a system in Pennsylvania here of a soybean, wheat, and corn 3-year rotation with and without cover crops, where there's a rye cover crop after corn and a red clover cover crop after wheat. And then we simulated the nitrogen leaching as well as many other functions coming out of the system. The important thing to note here is that when those cash crops are growing, we have virtually no nitrate leaching going on in those systems. And this is true from field data as well in many studies, that when we're in exponential growth of those crops, we retain our nitrogen very effectively. Where we see our nitrate losses is in our overwintering seasons, particularly spring. And where we see the cover crop, even that small little blip of rye biomass, it's a short window. I know this is a struggle in this region as well. You don't get much growth in production, but that small blip of rye biomass was enough to reduce leaching by about 30% in this estimate, in this study. So we know that a lot of, both from this simulation modeling and also field research, say at the Kellogg Biological Station in Michigan, have found that this leaching losses are primarily in the off-season and after corn. So having cover crops in those systems, and there have been meta-analyses supporting this, we can sop up basically a lot of that nitrogen and retain it in the system in some way. So that's nice, that's great. But the other thing that cover crops are doing is they are contributing and building soil carbon, and carbon is linked to nitrogen in our organic matter. So they're building some internal nitrogen cycling capacity in those systems. And so the question is, to what extent can we leverage that? Because even in our heavily fertilized systems in Iowa, as well as our more low intensity, low input systems in Colorado, I could estimate that about 50% of our nitrogen every year in that year's crop comes from the mineralization of background organic matter, even in our fertilized systems. So we spent a lot of time focusing on our fertilizer management because that's a pool that's lost. We spent a lot less time thinking about, can we actually manage that mineralization process more carefully? We have PSNT tests, we have soil tests, we have models that try to estimate and predict nitrogen mineralization potential, but can we actually in time and space try to manage it with the plants that we put in there? And so this is a question that I think is interesting to get at. So one of the questions, so before we get that, is, I forgot I was going to get to this part first, so I was skipping ahead, is that there's a lot of uncertainty at the extent to which cover crops actually build soil carbon and nitrogen pools. And so we've been working on a project to inform greenhouse gas decision support tools like Comet Farm and Cool Farm Tool that are increasingly of interest if there would be, state policies or markets that are looking to mitigate climate change or to look at carbon markets. They need to have some certainty in those estimates. And so we're trying to help inform some of that. And so some of the questions we've had is, okay, does it matter if you have a cover crop A or B? Okay, that's the simple first question. The next question is, does it matter what kind it is? Does it matter what functional type it is? Does it matter if it's grown in monocultures or mixtures? There's a lot of interest, worked with a lot of growers that are putting 12, 14 species in the field. Does that perform differently than monocultures? Does it matter what the growth window of when that cover crop is in the rotation in terms of its growing season, growing length? And so I have a student who's been working on a meta-analysis, and this is more just a teaser if any of you are going to San Antonio to go see her talk there, where she's going to present some of the initial results from this meta-analysis of cover crop studies across temperate regions. We simplified it to just those temperate regions and looked at soil carbon as a first glance. We're going to try to look at some of the other greenhouse gas emissions, but that data, of course, is notoriously messy. So I'll start with the soil carbon data, and cover crops increase soil carbon. Okay, so in a meta-analysis where we're looking at control versus treatment, the relative response ratio is on the y-axis here. We see that all the studies that are positive here had a net gain of soil carbon when cover crop was in that study, in that system, relative to a no cover crop control. This is just showing the distribution of the data points. The average was, across the studies, an increase of 1.1 megagrams of carbon per hectare. We standardized to the top 30 centimeters across this, and the average study length was about 4 years. So if you put this on an annualized, you could think about maybe about 0.3 megagrams, which is in line with some previous regression type data syntheses. So, but the question was, okay, they do increase soil carbon. Our models were already suggesting that, but can we actually see what's causing this variation across these systems? And so cover crop biomass is one. So we had several moderators that explained that variation. Cover crop biomass was one. So the more cover crop biomass you grow, the more soil carbon, particularly once you got above about 7 megagrams per hectare per year. Interestingly, growing season had a big impact. We still need to tease out some of these interactions, but a fall and winter killed cover crop window accrued more soil carbon than some of our summer and overwintering. That's probably because we have a lot of puny little rye overwintering cover crops in cold climates in that data set. Less surprisingly, in a no-till system, we had greater soil carbon than in a tilled system. And again, we're looking at just the top 30 centimeters. There were greater gains in warmer climates and in perennial systems, because we actually had some vineyard systems in here with perennial ground covers. Our initial question about whether cover crop type mattered does not come out as a significant factor, and there are some data limitations there. We tried to bin legume, non-legume, and brassica or others, but again, cover crop type didn't seem to matter. It was more the biomass. And interestingly, the study length didn't seem to matter. So the longer you had the cover crops in there, we didn't see a significant increase in the soil carbon. And so we're trying to tease some of that out. Not too surprisingly, average study length is 4 years. How long is a grant cycle? 4 years, right? So that is a limitation just in the data that's available. So we know cover crops are building these soil carbon and nitrogen pools in these systems, and we have some information that we can then put in these decision support tools. Like, it might be more important to get some estimate of these factors in a very simplified tool like Cool Farm Tool, where they're not running background simulation models. These might be the factors they want to know a little bit more information about, and maybe these are less important in terms of user inputs to inform or reduce the variation around our estimates on soil carbon gains. So then I want to step back to the line I'd started before I forgot that I had that bit in, and talk about to what extent then can we leverage this increased reservoir of soil carbon and nitrogen by looking at the mechanisms by which plants mediate nitrogen mineralization, basically. And so this is a study by Candace Carter, who's a master's student. She actually works for the Cargill Specialty Oilseeds Group in Fort Collins and is doing a master's project on the side. So the beauty is that she had access to all these canola genotypes and genetic diversity in canola lines. And so we wanted to look at to what extent is there variation in canola types and their ability to access nitrogen from different sources. And so we had a high organic matter soil that we diluted with sand to create a low organic matter soil, and then we crossed that with a high and a low fertilizer rate in these pots. We selected the canola genotypes these are NAM lines of canola. That's about all I'm going to tell you about breeding. But they had as much genetic variation as we could get within that population while maintaining similar phenology, so they had similar flowering times. And so the fertilizer that we added was ammonium nitrate. It was dual N15 enriched. And so then we could track the relative contributions of the soil and the fertilizer into the plant nitrogen uptake using that isotope. So spoiler alert, genotype didn't matter. Okay, so as much as we were hoping that plants might have some variation in these uptake patterns, we saw no differences across the genotypes in any of the measurements we looked at in this study. So that means we had really high replication once we looked beyond genotype, but there were some other interesting outcomes from this study that I want to talk about. So here is the different treatments. So the first two are always going to be the high organic matter treatments. These are the low organic, and then again crossed with high and low fertilizer rates. And this is total above ground nitrogen uptake in those systems. So we created a fertility gradient across these treatments where the high going down to the low had different availabilities of nitrogen. We expected that we had given this high fertilizer canola enough nitrogen to grow. We expected that to be equal at least to this high fert one. But what we found was that those two sources were actually additive rather than substitutive in terms of the plant growth. And having less fertilizer didn't make them better at accessing organic matter in this situation. Once we got to the lower, more nitrogen limited systems, we found that the plants with more fertilizer were able to access a little bit more of that organic matter than the really nitrogen limited, probably because they had larger root systems and larger biomass to explore that environment. In terms of the percentage of the nitrogen they were able to access, we're back at kind of our standard field estimate levels of about less than 50% of that nitrogen we applied actually getting into the crop itself. And interestingly, we don't see much difference in the efficiency with which the plants take up that nitrogen, irrespective of whether they were more or less nitrogen stressed, until we get to the really nitrogen stressed, and then they just can't access it. So we also looked at, we didn't open up the black box of the soil microbes, but we did look at soil enzyme activity in here, trying again to look at, are the plants enhancing rhizosphere microbial activity such that we have different enzymes in there being produced by the microbes that might facilitate nutrient cycling in different ways. Again, no genotype effects, but some interesting treatment effects in here. So again, high organic matter, not too surprisingly, we have more organic matter, more microbial activity, more enzyme production in general. But what was surprising was that we had a suppression, particularly in our low organic matter soils, consistently across all the enzymes we looked at, a suppression of enzyme activity where we had nitrogen fertilizer, higher nitrogen fertilizer treatments. This is surprising because these aren't all nitrogen cycling enzymes. So we have some that are more focused on nitrogen mineralization. We have some that are more integrated carbon and nitrogen. But even our phosphatase enzyme that's connected to phosphorus cycling was suppressed in the addition and the presence of nitrogen fertilizer. So we checked pH. There were no differences in pH. I'm still scratching my head a little bit on how to explain this. I talked to some people earlier today. If you have great theories on this, please let me know. But I think it's important to understand how these systems are operating if we want to utilize both of these sources effectively to grow crops. All right, so kind of pulling that together, we can, through diversifying our systems by using those non-crop windows, we can soak up some nitrate, we can build some soil carbon and nitrogen reservoirs. We still need to do more work to understand how we can mediate the mineralization of that organic matter. But we also know that cover crops do a lot more than that in terms of building some of that internal resilience capacity in terms of weed suppression. We did, again, simulation modeling, but also field studies that show multiple beneficial outcomes of integrating this little bit of cover crop diversity into these rotation systems. But how does that work in water-limited systems? So if we move this now to a Colorado context, which is dominated by winter wheat in this region, our metrics of success and the functions that we need and prioritize are different in this area, where we're not as much worried in these non-irrigated dryland systems with nitrogen retention, but more erosion control and water use efficiency, possibly more than pest suppression because it's so dry that pest pressures are much reduced in that region, for example. And so how do we then adapt some of these questions to that context? And this has been sort of my learning curve over the last 5 years of changing climate context completely in research. So we've been looking at these systems in the eastern plains of Colorado up into the panhandle of Nebraska. The dominant rotation in this region for a long time has been wheat and fallow. So it's about 10 months of a winter wheat crop that's planted last few weeks that will be harvested next July, and then an entire 14-month period of fallow that's maintained without weed growth, either using tillage or more commonly now in no-till systems using herbicides to suppress weed production. And the whole purpose of this fallow period is to store soil moisture to stabilize the wheat yields. So we're talking extensive land use where only half of the land is in production any given year. Half is in fallow and half is in wheat. There are many reasons to think that this can be problematic. We have huge issues with herbicide-tolerant weeds emerging. We have erosion issues, soil quality, degradation when you're not growing biomass in the system, and frankly, it's just expensive to maintain. But it does do the job of stabilizing wheat yields. And so there's been a long-term experiment in eastern Colorado, these yellow stars here, and also in the panhandle of Nebraska that have looked at as no-till was adopted in these systems and more residue was retained. The theory was it was improving water cycling such that they can intensify and actually add more crops into those systems. And so we wanted to see, because we're still seeing limited adoption of those more intensive systems, so we're saying going from wheat fallow to wheat corn fallow to wheat corn millet without fallow, so a continuous crop. And we have this gradient of sort of intensity of cropping across the landscape, and we wanted to understand why certain farmers were choosing these different rotations and how they were performing differently for them. And so this is work that Steve Rosenzweig, a PhD student, did. And these are all the non-stars are farmers' fields in those different rotation systems where green is continuous. The triangles are fallow once every 3 to 4 years. And then the red is a wheat fallow system. And he went and soil sampled all of those fields, as well as gathered 5-year management history from all of those farmers. So what did we find? I'm only going to show you one of these bar plots, and just trust me that all of them basically follow this exact same pattern. So instead of showing you 10 of these, I'm going to show you one. This is wheat fallow going to the mid-intensity continuous. At our long-term sites, we had 30-year perennial grass CRP as sort of a check, a benchmark of sorts. This is mean weight diameter of soil aggregates, so this is an index of soil aggregation across these systems, and we see going from wheat fallow to continuous, we have this increase in aggregation. We found the same stair step for pretty much every variable that we measured across the landscape, but nothing compared to, say, our perennial grasslands. So we could use that to look at, this is a structural occasion model, looking at the interaction then of these. And not too surprisingly, climate, so potential evapotranspiration was important in influencing soil carbon, so is our soil texture. But our intensity gradient, so this is the mid and continuous relative to wheat fallow, both directly and indirectly influenced soil carbon and mediated some by soil fungal communities, increasing in those more continuous rotations, as well as those two being linked and explaining the variation we found in our soil aggregation. And soil aggregation is considered really critical in our region. I'll come back to this later for its potential to increase infiltration and improve the water dynamics. So the other bar graphs that I could have shown you that follow the exact same trend and have the same statistical significance was increased mycorrhizal colonization and phosphorus uptake by wheat, going from wheat fallow to continuous, increased nitrogen mineralization potential. Because they're adding more crops into the rotation, on an annualized basis, they're harvesting more grain. However, taking that fallow out and using that moisture to grow a crop, instead of banking some of it in the soil, only about 30% of it's left. It's not a very efficient way of storing moisture, but that does reduce wheat yields by about 30% on average across these fields. However, these are all no-till systems we looked at. They reduce their herbicide use by 50 to 70% coming across that. And when we look at then the net profitability of that, it came out as more profitable to do either mid or continuous relative to wheat fallow in that system. So we could actually look then using the USDA croplands data layers at the landscape scale to see to what extent these rotation systems are really changing at that landscape scale and estimate what that impact might be for, say, herbicide use or soil carbon changes at the landscape scale. And what we see is we're at a tipping point right now where the red line is our wheat fallow, the blue is that mid-intensity, and the slowly increasing green is our continuous cropping system. And so wheat fallow, probably for the first time in decades, is no longer the dominant rotation system on that landscape. And we are seeing this transition. Yet the one that we found to be most profitable is slowly increasing. So that's raised some questions of why and how, and I'll come back to that near the end because we did some interviews with farmers on that. So one of the questions then is what are farmers using to replace fallow with? They can use things like millet, but there is also interest in some farmers in the soil health movement in our region, but we have no water to support it. Uh-oh. No, don't do anything. And so, but they are looking at cover crops, which do consume water in our region, and that would then impact the next crop as forage crops. And so we just are finishing an NRCS-funded project on farm looking at the potential to integrate diversified cover crop mixtures and actually use them more as forage. And are we giving up some of the conservation or soil health benefits by grazing them in that system? And then what are the economic trade-offs? So trying to look at that system, that practice within these water-limited regions. So what am I talking about? I'm talking about planting a cover crop in mid-March. All the farmers, we got them to agree to plant the exact same mix across all their fields. That was quite a conversation. They get a very short grazing window, only about 30 days, because by the time the forage is big enough to start getting cattle on, 30 days later, the cool season grasses in that mix, the oats and the barley have gone to maturity, and so they need to terminate. So it's a very short growing season, but it's very high quality forage, and they got very decent gains of their cattle off of that animal performance-wise. Then the cover crop was terminated. We took soil sampling at the end of termination. When the cover crop was terminated, we did soil moisture at wheat planting and then followed that wheat crop till the next year when it was harvested. In each field, we had 4 blocks and replicated grazed blocks, and within that we had grazing exclosures as well as fallow areas where we sprayed out after emergence the cover crop. So we can compare those treatments. So one of the big challenges in our region is year-to-year variability, which we definitely saw. This is the forage production across those farm fields in 2016 and 2017. You'll see we had about twice as much biomass production in the first year than the second. The second year was just a cool, dry spring, right? It happens. This just shows you the diversity within the mixtures. Is dominated by cool season grasses, basically, particularly in the first year. Second year, when we had slower growth, we had more diversity in there, but we also, that top green bar is weeds. We also had a little more weed pressure come in that year. So I'm going to jump through these kind of quickly, but what we found was so those cover crops are only growing for 90 days, and they're only grazed for 30 days. Even in that short time window, both years consistently, messy, noisy on-farm data set, we found an increase in soil aggregation in those systems. So this is aggregation in the grazed cover crops relative to the fallow area in both years was significantly higher. The ungrazed actually, interestingly, came out somewhere in between. So we did not find negative effects on any soil health indicators of having the grazing in there. And in fact, we found one positive effect. They were able to skip one herbicide input while they were growing these cover crops. That sort of offset the seed cost of the cover crop. They diversified their income stream by integrating the livestock. They did have increased labor, fencing, hauling water, things like that. Soil moisture was reduced. So soil moisture below 3 feet was higher in our fallow versus our other treatments. And that had very inconsistent effects on the next wheat crop, where on average wheat yields were reduced, but it was sort of 1 out of 4, 1 out of 5 fields each year where we saw a significant reduction in yield. Once we put, even with that yield reduction, into an economic analysis, it was net profitable for the farmers, from what we could see. So coming back to this, there was a nice recent meta-analysis that looked at some of these systems. So we've been looking at aggregation as an indicator of potential for infiltration, in particular in our region. And this study was nice. It came out and corroborated some of that. This just is an image showing the meta-analysis results where they saw higher infiltration in their cover crop-based systems or perennial root systems compared to their other systems. So we think it's really important in these short-term effects in improving the water cycling in our water-limited systems. But as we move back to this question of groundwater, one way that I think this is going to become increasingly important then is building our soil health or soil quality or soil aggregation, whatever you want to call it. As we get to lower water availability, it becomes increasingly important. We can use irrigation to cover up a lot of these differences, but it's an estimated about a quarter of the Ogallala Aquifer region that if we continue status quo pumping, will no longer support irrigated agriculture by 2100 in this region. There's a lot we can do in these other regions. We can achieve sustainable pumping in some of these other regions, but some regions are really looking at transitioning out of irrigated ag in the not so distant future. And so within this context, we know that how we manage our soils is going to be important. But getting beyond that is a huge question for communities to wrestle with. And so this is where, in the last couple minutes, I'm going to quickly introduce this other concept of resilience. So I talked about, can we build the ecological resilience by building that internal capacity of the system to maintain itself in the face of stresses, right? And maybe reduce reliance on some of those external inputs. But the other, I think, probably equally or more important capacity of a system is its ability to adapt, its flexibility, ability to adapt, and in the case of those transitioning systems, to actually transform to something different. And so we have probably in our ag systems what we might call sort of persistent systems. And what we've found in talking to farmers is that where we might lack things is some flexibility in their ability to innovate and try some of these new systems and adapt as climates change, as resource availability changes. I'm going to jump through that and go to this. So as I mentioned, those farmers that were choosing those different rotations, Steve actually did sociological interviews with those farmers. We have a rural sociology paper, my first sociology paper. I'm kind of excited about that. And so he asked basically, what are the factors that influence farmers' decisions, whether to fallow or to crop, basically, in those systems? Some of the things that came out of it were totally different trusted sources of information. who they were talking to. There were mindsets about, I really want to be able to say this is my wheat yield, and if I have another crop there, I have a much lower yield and I'm not maximizing that yield. Crop insurance came up repeatedly as actually a disincentive for taking fallow out of the rotation because it's hard to insure wheat. You can't even get crop insurance for wheat in some regions if you don't have fallow before it. And then it's, what are we going to grow? What are we going to grow? The elevator only takes a couple crops. We don't have a processing facility for that. We don't have markets for other crops. So what else are we going to grow? In the groundwater perspective, we've done some similar analyses. Matt Sanderson is the sociologist on that project, and he redid a survey of irrigators in that region that was done about 30 years ago and asked them, how concerned are you about groundwater? The actual identical percentage point, it was the exact same as it was 30 years ago. Meaning they were very concerned then, they're very concerned today. They feel like they're doing what they can within their current constraints to manage their water efficiently. But I think importantly, they really believe that there's a future value in keeping that. There's a very altruistic reason why they want to keep that groundwater around. One is for risk management in years of drought. But the other questions where they had the greatest agreement was to sustain my community and for my future generations of my family. And so we've been doing work trying to facilitate some of these dialogues around how do we build some of this collective shared resource, shared governance of these groundwater systems. And there's some really cool examples in Kansas where some farmers have actually self-organized and restricted themselves and set their own pumping limits. And it's been in place long enough that we can see that they achieved those goals without taking an economic hit. They adapted, they changed crops, they became more efficient with their irrigation management. And so moving forward, I think it's really important to think about setting some policy limits can be used as a really important way to collectively incentivize adaptation of producers. But this was a beautiful example because they set the limit themselves because of that future value of water. So we're sharing a lot of ideas and information across the aquifer because aquifer water is managed very locally in these local management decision areas or regions. And then the final example, again, getting back to that question of, yeah, but we don't have markets for those crops, is we're actually working with the city of Denver that's developing food policies, and this is true for many urban areas. Consumers are paying attention to where their food comes from. That results in these explosion of urban food policy councils. They're setting priorities around procurement of food into city institutions or developing markets, other avenues. And around that, there are things like the Good Food Purchasing Program that had come out of Los Angeles. But as far as we can tell, no producers have actually had any input into guiding some of these policies that they're setting for procurement and how they're defining sustainability of production systems. So we are actively bringing producers. So I've been working with wheat producers to bring them into that conversation to think about how what Denver sets as food policy might cascade back out and influence their market channels in a way that potentially we could get some win-wins between urban food policy and actually rural community wealth and rural community well-being. And so we're looking at whole food supply chains using some agent-based modeling to look at if we put a shock down at the consumer end, to what extent does that ricochet back up the supply chain? So that brings us back to this concept of to what extent who has voice in some of these decisions and where do they have some flexibility to change, develop new markets, and adapt as things move forward. And I think with that, I have many people to thank. I guess that really is cut off. You can't see all their names. But graduate student Shelby McClellan, Candace Carter, former student Steve Rosenzweig are the data that I showed. James Hales, a sociology postdoc who's doing some farmer interviews right now. With that, I will stop and take any questions. Thanks.
What do you think the reasoning behind the increased aggregation under grazing?
My simplistic theory is that I think with grazing you have root die-off and root turnover, which probably stimulates some microbial activity potentially. Maybe that helps bind aggregates. We didn't see differences in compaction or bulk density, so I don't know if it's that. But whenever there's a grazing event, there is an enhanced root turnover. So that's the only thing I can think of. The open ideas. Yeah.
What was your question about the phosphatase activity? I was kind of way earlier on in the presentation,
Yeah.
but I kind of missed what your question was.
Yeah, great question. So we were interested. So we were adding nitrogen fertilizer, and that nitrogen fertilizer addition suppressed the expression or the activity of enzymes that microbes produce to break down phosphorus from, say, organic forms. I'm curious to know, so actually I talked to Mike Castellano a little bit about this earlier because he has some other research showing that fertilizer can suppress nitrogen mineralization enzymes. And so that, makes a little more sense that it would suppress the activity of some of the microbial processes if there's enough nitrogen already around. But why it would suppress phosphorus and carbon cycling enzymes as well, it seems like an across-the-board suppression of sort of microbial activity. Anyone know? Anyone got any ideas? Yeah.
Was the pH constant in both soils, including the sand amended soil?
So that was my first question. Let's go check all the pHs. Yes, they were consistent. That was exactly what I thought was going to be the case. Yeah. And again, it was just even within the same organic matter, all that we've changed is that fertilizer versus water addition. And the pH hadn't changed. I mean, maybe there's a smaller sensitivity to pH, some log scale. Maybe we measured it too coarsely. But yeah, that was my first thought. Yeah.
My thought was maybe that it would be like sort of a biological thing with the microbes where they have more nutrient availability from the fertilizer, they get kind of lazy.
Yeah, the only thing we changed was their nitrogen. Yeah. Yeah.
What was the texture of the soil that you had in Schipanski?
It was a clay, I think it's classified actually as a silt loam, but it was an 8% organic matter soil. Yeah.
So did the sand change the drainage and the water content and the air content?
Yeah, we did monitor moisture, water availability, and adjusted watering. I'm sure it did. But even within the same organic matter treatment, we were seeing these differences. Yeah, but we did try to control for differences in water holding capacity in those systems. But I'm sure, yeah, that's the challenge of looking at organic matter. It changes everything. Yeah. Yeah.
This might be a question for your sociologist, but how did you come up with the questions that you asked the farmers, and then did you find any correlation between their answers and how they maybe it changed their management practices or not?
Yeah, so we, the question, we went through several iterations of the questions, and it was a it was a semi-structured interview, meaning that there was an outline of questions, but then the conversation was allowed to free flow a bit from there. And a lot of the questions were sort of, why do you choose this? Why, if you did change, why did you change your rotation system? And I completely forget, several years ago. I don't remember all of the questions that were on there, though that we looked at them for a long time. We actually based it Jen Blush did some nice work actually in the Mississippi River Basin using a similar approach. And so we used her questions as sort of our starting outline and collaborated with Michael Carolyn. What was the second part of your question? What did we... Yeah, so then those interviews were actually completely transcribed and coded, and then you pull out these themes, and that's how we got to that. So there's a semi-quantitative way almost to analyze the words that come out in those interviews, so you see these repeating themes that you can connect back to then the different rotation systems and the different producers. Does that answer? Kind of. Okay. Yeah.
When you shift from fallow system to continuous cropping system, did you monitor the phosphorus availability? Because fallow system is known for the fallow syndrome, which is lack of phosphorus because lack of vegetation. Have you noticed that?
Yeah, we did measure total phosphorus in those rotation systems and did not see a difference. I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah, that was just a standard soil test phosphorus. We did not see differences in the phosphorus. I do think that fallow phase is a combination of nitrogen and water, actually, that they see the bump in yields from, and everyone talks about the water, but there is a nitrogen mineralization bump also that comes out of that fallow phase that I don't think gets talked
Does
about.
it affect the nitrogen use efficiency when you switch the system?
Yeah, so we didn't find, I didn't rush through some of this, but we didn't, as they went to more intensive rotations, they actually didn't increase their fertilizer inputs. So it was sort of like they were managing risk that way, that they knew that they might not maximize yield because of moisture, and so, but they're still building those carbon and nitrogen reserves. So I want to go back, and I don't know if we have enough data to look at a nitrogen balance to see, are they now at the point where they're mining their nitrogen? So that would suggest they have a higher nitrogen use efficiency because they're harvesting more crop with less, or the same inputs, basically. Yeah. Yeah.
In the study where you combine cover crops with grazing,
Yeah.
you said that ultimately it was more profitable than standard fallow rotation. Did the profitability calculation include the increased labor costs?
Yes. Yeah. So we did we actually had an economist work with us on those. It wasn't just us trying to do our little enterprise budgets. And so he took into consideration but it was their estimates of their labor in those actual systems that they input, and we did cost that out into that equation. That doesn't mean, so it came out as profitable, but it's a lot of work, and and those management trade-offs are important, yeah. And that will be a disincentive for some folks to not do it. Yeah. And some of them owned their own cattle, and some of them didn't, and that was another factor. Definitely was easier for those who owned their own cattle to move them in for 30 days and then back out, as opposed to bringing in someone else's cattle for 30 days where you may not already have the fencing and the water infrastructure and things. Great.
Well, if we have no more questions, let's thank our speaker one more time.